My son hugged me at the door and said it would only be for a week. His wife stood behind him, smiling too hard, the way people smile when they are trying to hide something. They told me her father was in a coma after an accident, that he needed someone older and patient to keep watch while they took a short trip. I believed them, because I wanted to believe my own family. The moment their car pulled away and the house fell quiet, I walked back to the guest room to check on the man they said could not wake up. I was humming to calm my nerves when his fingers moved. His eyes opened just enough to see me, and his voice came out like a thread of ice. He whispered for help, and then he said the words that made my spine freeze, because he wasn't talking about his pain. He was talking about mine. He said they were keeping him drugged, and he said he heard them talking about my money. Thank you for watching, it means more than you know. And before I go any further, tell me where you are watching from in the comments, because I read them when the house gets quiet and the memories get loud. My name is Pearl, and I live in New York, the kind of place where you learn to mind your business. But you also learn when something is wrong, because wrong has a smell and a weight to it. I stood there in that guest room with my heart beating hard against my ribs, looking at a man who had just told me he was not in a coma at all, and I felt the air change, like the house itself had been holding its breath until my son and his wife left. I wanted to run after them, to call my son and demand an explanation, but the whisper about my money sat in my stomach like a stone, because it meant the danger was not only in that bed, it was in my own trust. I leaned closer to the man, keeping my voice low, and I asked him what he meant. And his eyes flicked toward the door, like he expected someone to burst in at any second. He swallowed, his lips dry, and he told me they had been giving him pills that made his tongue heavy and his body slow, pills that kept him trapped behind his own eyelids while he could still hear everything around him. Then he tried to lift his hand again, and it shook like a leaf, and I saw fear in a grown man's face, the kind of fear that does not come from sickness alone, but from people you once trusted. I told him to blink if he could understand me, and he blinked, once, steady, and right then, I knew I was standing in the middle of something darker than a family favor. And whatever they had planned, they had not expected him to find his voice the moment they walked out the door. I kept my body between that bed and the doorway, not because I thought I could stop anyone if they came rushing in, but because something in me understood that the room had become a secret, and secrets can get people hurt when they are spoken too loud. I told him to rest his eyes, and I pulled the blanket up like I was only doing what I had been taught. The same careful motions my son and his wife showed me, the same gentle hands they praised when they needed me useful. As I stood there, I felt a strange shame rise in me, not because I had done anything wrong, but because I had trusted my own family without asking the hard questions. And at my age, you would think I would know better. My name is Pearl. I have lived long enough to watch people change right in front of me, to watch love turn quiet and promises turn into excuses. But I never thought I would have to watch my own son carry a lie into my house and lay it down like a blanket. I raised him in New York, in a small apartment where the radiator sang in winter and the street outside never truly slept. And I worked the kind of jobs that make your feet ache and your hands rough, because I wanted him to grow up feeling safe. I was not perfect, but I was present, and I taught him that when someone is weak, you do not take from them. You protect them, you speak for them, you stand between them and anybody trying to do harm. That is why, when he asked me to come for a week, it sounded like something I would do without thinking, because helping was part of who I had always been. And he knew that. His wife came into our lives with a smile that could charm a room, and manners that looked good in public. But there were moments when her eyes stayed too cold. Moments when she listened, like she was collecting information instead of sharing a life. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself I was being old-fashioned. I told myself to be grateful my son had someone. But standing there by that bed, watching that man fight through drugged breath, just to warn me, all my old excuses started falling apart. I thought about the way she had said my name when she asked for help, slow and sweet, like she was offering respect, but now it sounded different in my head, like she was testing how easy I would be to move into place. I looked at the man again, and I realized he was not just sick, he was trapped. And if he could hear them talking about my money, then they had been speaking freely in front of him, confident he would never be able to tell anyone. That kind of confidence does not come from a small mistake. It comes from a plan. And the hardest part was admitting to myself that my own son might be standing somewhere inside that plan, whether he understood it or not. I tried to steady my breathing because panic makes noise, and noise is what gets you noticed. And I did not know who could walk through that door at any moment. I leaned in close and asked him, as calm as I could manage, what exactly he heard, and his eyes filled the way a person's eyes fill when they have been holding fear in for too long. He whispered that they spoke about papers, about accounts, about control, and he said my name again, not like a stranger guessing, but like someone who had heard it used in a conversation that was never meant for me. I felt anger rise up under my ribs, hot and sharp, because it is one thing to lie, but it is another thing to lay a trap and call it family. I reached for my phone with hands that did not feel like mine, and I knew right then I could not afford to be polite. I could not afford to be confused, and I could not afford to wait for my son to come back and explain. Because whatever this was, it was already moving, and I was standing in the middle of it. I pressed record without thinking, keeping the phone low near the blanket so it would not catch the light. And I asked him to say it again, slowly, so I could understand, because my mind was racing faster than my heart could handle. He swallowed and whispered that they talked about getting him to sign things when he was too weak to fight, and when he could not hold a pen, they laughed about how easy it is to make an old man look confused. And then they started talking about me, about my savings, about how a mother will do anything if you make her feel responsible. My throat tightened, and for a moment I could not even hear the machine beeping. All I could hear was the memory of my son's voice at the door, warm and casual, asking me for a favor like it was nothing. I looked at that man's face and I believed him, because fear like his cannot be rehearsed, and I realized the real sickness in that room was not the accident. It was the kind of greed that wears a family smile. I left the room for a second, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to see what they had been giving him with my own eyes. And I needed to do it while my hands could still follow instructions. In the kitchen, I opened the cabinet they pointed out on the first day. The one they said held everything I would need. And there they were, the bottles lined up like little soldiers. Some with his name, some with no name at all. Some with labels half peeled away like somebody had not wanted questions. I turned one bottle slowly, reading the small print the way I used to read permission slips and school notices when my son was young, squinting and leaning closer under the light. And I felt my stomach tighten when I saw how strong the medication was. The kind of thing you do not hand out like candy. The kind of thing you give when you want a body quiet. I kept thinking, maybe I'm overreacting, maybe a doctor ordered it, maybe I'm not seeing the full picture. But then I remembered the way my son's wife spoke. Too firm, too smooth, like she had rehearsed every answer before I could ask a question. And I remembered that man's eyes, begging without the strength to shout. I went back to the guest room and checked the bedside table, and I noticed the little cup they left there for his pills, and the smell hit me, bitter and chemical, like something that did not belong in a home. He looked at me again, and I saw him trying to stay awake, trying to hold on to the thin thread of consciousness he had managed to pull together, and it broke my heart, because no one should have to fight like that just to be believed. I leaned close and told him I was going to get help. Not tomorrow, not when it was convenient, but right now. And I watched relief flicker across his face so fast it almost disappeared. My fingers hovered over my phone, and I felt the weight of what I was about to do, because calling for help meant admitting out loud that my own family might have done something terrible. But staying quiet would mean I was helping the terrible thing continue. And I could not live with that. I stepped into the hallway and closed the door until it was barely cracked, just enough so I could still hear the machine and know he was breathing. And then I called 911, with my voice as steady as I could make it, The way you speak when you are trying not to scare yourself. I told the dispatcher there was an elderly man in my home, that he had been described to me as being in a coma, but he was awake enough to speak, and he believed he was being over-medicated, and I needed an ambulance immediately. The dispatcher asked questions, and I answered them one by one, giving the address, explaining the equipment in the room, explaining that his caretakers had left town, and even as I spoke, I could feel my hands trembling, not from fear of the ambulance, but from the understanding that once those sirens came, there would be no going back to the old version of our family. I went back inside and sat beside him, and I kept my face calm for his sake, because I could see how hard it was for him to stay present, how the drugs pulled at him, like a heavy tide trying to drag him under. I asked him to blink if he could hear me, and he blinked again, and I told him the help was on the way, and that he had done the right thing by speaking, because silence was what they were counting on. While we waited, I took another short recording, not because I wanted drama, but because I knew the truth has to survive the moment, and I had seen too many families twist stories when the facts get uncomfortable. He whispered a few broken phrases: pension, card, papers, and then he said something else that settled deep in my chest. He said they talked about making me sign as a witness, making it look like I agreed, making it look like I was the one who made decisions. My eyes burned, and I stared at the door like I could see my son and his wife walking back through it, smiling and pretending, and for the first time in my life I understood that love can be used as a leash if you let it. When the distant sound of sirens finally rose and grew louder, I felt relief and grief at the same time. Relief because help was coming, and grief because I was about to expose something I never wanted to believe about the people closest to me. The paramedics came in fast, calm and focused, and the moment they saw the bottles and the setup, their faces changed in a way that told me I was not imagining things. They asked me what he had taken, and when, and I showed them the cabinet, the cups, the notes my son's wife left like instructions for a recipe, and I watched one of them take pictures with a work phone, because even they understood this was not just medical, it was suspicious. They checked his pupils, his breathing, his blood pressure, and when he tried to speak again, his voice was weak but clear enough to make the room go still, because he said he was being kept sedated on purpose. I stood back as they lifted him onto the stretcher, and I felt my knees wobble, because it is one thing to fear something in your mind, and it is another thing to watch the proof roll out of your house under bright lights. As they wheeled him toward the ambulance, one of the paramedics looked at me and said they would have the hospital evaluate for over-medication and possible abuse. And that word, abuse, landed heavy, because it meant my son and his wife had crossed a line that could not be smoothed over with apologies. I locked the door behind us, and I realized the house already felt different, like it had been holding a lie and was finally letting it go. At the hospital, they moved him through double doors, and I followed as far as they would let me, holding my purse so tight my fingers ached, because when you are scared, you hold on to the smallest things like they can keep you steady. A nurse stopped me with a gentle hand and asked who I was, and when I told her I was the one left to care for him, her eyes narrowed just a little, not at me, but at the situation, like she had seen this kind of story walk into the emergency room before. They put me in a waiting area that smelled like disinfectant and burnt coffee, and I sat there listening to the faraway sounds of wheels on tile, voices calling codes, and doors opening and shutting, and with every minute that passed, I kept hearing that man's whisper in my head. How he said he was not in a coma. How he said they kept him quiet. How he said they were talking about my money, like it was already in their hands. A doctor came out, after what felt like forever, and asked me about the medication, and I told him the truth, that I did not prescribe anything. I only followed instructions I was given. And the doctor's expression hardened in a way that made my chest tighten, because he did not look confused, he looked concerned. He said the levels in his system did not match what a normal home recovery would require. And he said words like over-medicated and sedated, and he asked if there were concerns about elder abuse. And when he said it out loud, it felt like the floor shifted under my feet. I wanted to argue, to defend my son the way a mother's heart tries to defend, even when the mind is screaming. But my mouth went dry, because my son's wife had been too organized, too controlling, too confident, and confidence like that usually comes from planning, not from panic. As I sat there, I thought about all the times I said yes without asking why, all the times I let myself be treated like a tool instead of a person. And it hit me that this was never just about caring for a sick man. It was about using my presence to make something look normal, to make paperwork look clean, to make a lie look like family duty. Then the nurse returned and told me a social worker was coming to speak with me. And I knew that whatever happened next would decide what kind of woman I was going to be for the rest of my life. The kind who stays quiet to keep peace, or the kind who tells the truth even when it breaks her heart. The social worker sat across from me with a notepad and a calm voice, and she asked me to start from the beginning, not the medical details, but the family details. Who brought him into the house, who left, who controlled the pills, who made the rules. I told her everything. The rushed request, the strict instructions, the cabinet of bottles, and the moment his eyes opened and he warned me about my money. And when I mentioned that I had recordings, her posture changed like she had just found a key. Not long after that, a police officer joined us, polite but serious, and he asked to see the videos and the photos. And I handed over my phone with my hands still shaking, because it felt like I was placing my own son's name onto a table where it might not come back clean. The officer listened, and when the weak voice on my recording said, "Help me, I am not in a coma, they keep giving me pills," I saw something in the officer's face settle into certainty. And certainty is dangerous when you have a family secret. He told me they would open an investigation, that the hospital would document the drug levels, and that they needed to secure any paperwork from the house before it could disappear. And that was when I understood how close I had been to becoming a silent witness to something I never agreed to. I nodded and agreed to cooperate, and even though my heart was breaking, I felt a hard kind of strength rise in me, because if my son and his wife had chosen greed over decency, then I had to choose truth over comfort. When they finally let me see him again, he looked smaller than he did in that guest room. Not because he had shrunk, but because the hospital bed made him look like someone the world had pushed down too many times. His eyes were clearer now, still tired, still heavy, but present. And the first thing he did when he saw me was reach out his hand. Like he needed to make sure I was real. Like he needed proof that someone had heard him. I sat beside him and held his fingers carefully, and he whispered, "Thank you," not the polite kind, the desperate kind. The kind you say when you have been alone inside your own body for too long. I told him he did not have to force his voice, that the doctors were helping him, that the police were involved, and I watched his eyelids flutter as if he wanted to cry but did not have enough strength to waste on tears. He took a slow breath and began to tell me what really happened. Not just the accident, but everything after it. And the way he spoke was steady now, as if once the drug fog lifted, he could finally place his life back in order and point to the parts that were stolen. He said his daughter started handling his pension because she said it was easier. And at first he believed her, because you want to believe your own family is doing right by you, and then he noticed money missing. Small amounts at first, then bigger. And when he questioned it, she said he was confused. She said the accident affected his mind. She said he should rest and let her take control. He told me she began bringing him pills even when he said he did not need them. And when he refused, she would get sweet, then sharp, then angry, and eventually she started giving them to him in his food or his drink. And he would wake up hours later with time missing, with his tongue thick, with his arms too heavy to lift. He said he heard my son and his wife talking in the hallway late at night, talking like people who thought they were safe, talking about guardianship and signatures, and how easy it is to make an older person look incapable. And then he paused and looked at me with a sadness that made my throat burn. He said he heard them mention me, not as family, but as a next step. And he said the words that shook me all over again. He said they talked about using me because I was dependable, because I would not cause trouble, because I would do what I was told if they wrapped it in the language of care. I sat there holding his hand, and I felt something crack inside me. Because it meant they did not only plan to take from him, they planned to borrow my love and turn it into a weapon against me. And the worst part was realizing how close they might have been to succeeding if he had not opened his eyes at the right time. After I left his room, I sat in my car for a long minute, with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. Because my mind was trying to accept a truth my heart did not want to hold. I called the officer back and told him what the father had said, that he heard them discussing guardianship and accounts, and the officer's voice stayed calm. But he moved fast, telling me they were already preparing to secure the house and collect any documents connected to financial control. I drove back with my chest tight, and every red light felt like it was stretching time, because I kept imagining my son's wife rushing through drawers, pulling papers, erasing proof, turning the whole thing into my word against theirs. When I reached the street, there were already 2 patrol cars parked near the house, and an officer met me at the sidewalk and explained they had enough cause to protect evidence, especially with the hospital confirming the sedation. I nodded, and even though it hurt to watch strangers treat my son's home like a scene that needed guarding, it hurt more to think about what would have happened if no one had shown up at all. As they walked through the doorway, I stood outside in the cold air, and I realized I was not just waiting for answers anymore. I was waiting to see who my son would choose to be when the truth finally met him face to face. I did not have to wait long, because once their plane landed and their phones came back to life, the calls started coming in back to back. My son first, then his wife, then my son again, and each ring sounded less like concern and more like panic, trying to dress itself up as love. I let it ring while the officers carried out folders and envelopes, and when I finally answered, my son's voice broke the moment he heard mine, asking where I was, asking what happened, asking why the house was surrounded, and I told him the truth in the same calm voice I used when he was a boy, and I had to correct him. That a man they called unconscious had opened his eyes, that the hospital confirmed he was drugged, that the police were involved, and that I had proof. His wife jumped onto the call, sharp and offended, saying I had no right, saying I overreacted, saying I ruined everything. And that word, everything, told me more than any confession, because good people do not call the truth a ruin, only plans do. I ended the call before my emotions could spill, because I refused to argue with someone who had already decided my silence was part of her strategy. And I stood there on the sidewalk, watching the front door close behind the officers, feeling grief for the family I thought I had, and relief that I finally chose to protect myself and someone who could not protect himself. Thank you for staying with me till the end. If this story touched you, please subscribe so you can keep listening to my stories.